By the end of this video, you will know everything about the Panov variation in the Caro Kann defense and how to beat it. So let's get started. The Panov variation arises from the move order e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, and c4. The point is that white wants to compensate for the fact that white has traded off their e pawn for their c pawn by trading off one of our central pawns for their own c pawn. We're going to play knight f6 here, and the most common response is knight c3. Everything else is very dubious, or generally speaking, transposes into any other variation that we can play in. Let's now quickly look over the plans and ideas of the Panov variation. So right here, we can see the pawn structure that will generally arise from the Panov. Now, keep in mind, there are multiple ways for black to approach the Panov variation. I'll only be showing one of them that I believe is the best and that has been adopted by many grandmasters in recent times. It's one of the most solid ways to play, and it proves that white cannot ever gain an advantage if we play this accurately. We get an IQP position. If you guys don't know what an IQP is or how to play it, please consider checking out the video that is linked above. I have made an entire video dedicated to dissecting the isolated queen spawn pawn structure and how to play against it. However, I will also mention our ideas in this video. So, what is white's idea? Well, white wants to keep as many pieces on the board as possible. White wants rapid development by placing the queen on b3, for example, and eventually preparing a d5 push. So white wants to take control of this d5 square and create an attack on us. Likewise, in the IQP position, we always want to control the square ahead of the pawn in order to prevent it from being pushed. And if it were to get pushed, we want to be able to capture it. So we're going to sometimes place this knight on f6. We're going to place the knight on d7 and b6 in some variations. And we're either going to blockade it by placing a knight on d5 to prevent the possibility of d5 happening, or we're just going to have so many pieces piled up on this file with like queen d6, for example, rook f8, that this pawn is never going to get pushed. If we get prompted with a trade opportunity, we're generally speaking going to take it. So trades are beneficial for us in an IQP, because if we simplify down and there's like, let's say a queen and a rook versus a queen and rook in this sort of position, black would be completely winning because the IQP is a weakness, which we would be able to exploit. And it's a weakness because other pieces are constantly forced to protect this pawn since there are no adjacent pawns that could possibly protect it. Whereas in our pawn structure, we're very, very solid. So let's move on to the actual theory. The move I recommend is g6, and you can play a bunch of moves here. You can play knight c6, you can play e6, you can play bishop e6. The reason I recommend g6 is because it's the most flexible move to play, and it's very, very easy for us to equalize and sometimes even gain an advantage. The reason I don't like e6, for example, is that it locks this light square bishop in, and bishop e6 is just very awkward to play. Like this e-pawn is stuck here. The development of this bishop is somewhat difficult. I guess you could do it through g6 as well. But once again, very awkward position. In knight c6, it dedicates this knight to the square. It commits it to c6. Whereas in a lot of variations, it would actually be better placed on b6. And so by playing c6, we're basically telling white that this is our plan, and we lose any sort of flexibility that we could have potentially had in this position. Now that we've chosen g6, let's quickly cover some sidelines first that you may or may not encounter. So if white plays very lazily with, let's say, knight f3, we're just going to play bishop g7, then we're going to castle. We're going to bring this knight out to c6 or d7, depending on what white plays. But basically, our play is very intuitive. As long as this queen remains on b1, we always have this bishop g4 pin. Unlike if the queen were to, say, be on b3, bishop g4 would be a very awkward move because it would provoke knight e5 and there would be no pin. So always keep that in mind. Let's say bishop b2 gets played. We can castle here. Let's say castling happens. We can play bishop g4 right away, and this would be a very nice position. Or we can just start with knight c6. We could even capture this pawn if we wanted to in order to make this bishop waste a tempo since it already moved out once. And then bishop g4 would be a very interesting move. From there, we also have knight c6. So you don't have to start with bishop g4. I'm just showing you guys the ideas here. There's no real theory in this because nobody at the highest level would play this. But you may encounter this in your regular games because if somebody doesn't know the theory, knight f3 is very intuitive. So we could start with knight c6 and then like prompt bishop g4 just a little bit later. But basically, this is the whole point. You're going to play bishop g4 and then you're going to aim at the pawn. Once again, this is an IQP or an isolated queen spawn pawn structure, which means that our primary goal is to prevent d5 from ever happening. We can do this via a blockade or via stacking pieces on this file and to prevent d5 from ever happening. So queen d6, rook d8, rook c8, that is kind of our ideas. We can even play knight a5 and try to trade this bishop off since it's one of the pieces that, supports the d5 square. And in the IQP, trading off pieces is always a good thing for the side opposing the IQP. If you get awkward moves like bishop e3, once again, just bishop g7, we're going to simply develop in the same way we normally would, and we're going to stick to our opening principles, and we're going to be completely fine and, winning most of these games. Now it's time to get into the real moves. So let's cover c takes d5 first, because it's a very straightforward move. And here we can start with bishop g7 if we wanted to, but the best move is just to take this pawn since we can. One thing to note is this capture is never going to happen, and if it does, Black is going to be significantly better here because we're much better developed. For example, our queen cannot be a target since there's no knight that can jump into c3, and this queen is very strong. We can target this d4 square. We can also attack this g2 pawn. So if this bishop was to ever move, this pawn would always be hanging. The most popular move here for white is bishop c4, and we're never going to be capturing this knight because after b takes, white has justified this entire setup. Now bishop g7 is pointless since this bishop is going to be staring at a bunch of pawns, right? So it's going to be a very bad bishop, whereas white has much greater development. This bishop is very strong. Queen b3 is coming. This bishop has easy development. We have knight f3 and castling, so white's going to be better in this sort of variation. That's why we're never going to trade this knight, and instead we're going to play knight b6. This comes with tempo. Also, one thing to know is, why would not knight f6? Why not just go back? Well, that pretty much wasted tempo because we've gone back to where we were. This is the exact same position, except now this pawn is missing, so it's been traded off. But there's a bishop on c4. So we're undoing progress, and this move does not force white to react since knight b6, it attacks this bishop. This bishop is currently hanging, so it forces a move out of white. Whereas knight f6 is just, it's useless. It's really, really slow, and it doesn't attack anything. Knight b6 gets played. Let's quickly go over what happens if white allows this trade to happen. If white plays queen b3, for example, which is a real possibility, has been played a lot, especially in amateur games, we will simply capture this bishop. And after this capture, we're going to play bishop g7. Let's say knight f3. I'm just showing you guys exactly what would happen. Like, these are some top engine moves. I'm going to castle, knight d7, and knight b6. Once again, the idea is the same. In an IQP situation, we want to control this d5 square. Now, knight b6 is even sweeter this time because it also attacks the queen with tempo. So let's say something like rook d1 gets played. We have knight b6 after queen b3. This is a whole line I cooked up. And we have bishop e6, very powerful move. Obviously, d5 is not possible here because we would win this trade. And the best move for white here, and it's the only move that keeps it equal, actually anything else is much better for black, is this rook sacrifice. And so black gets a rook for a bishop and a pawn. However, white gets a slightly more active position. I still think this is much better for black. Like, it's very intuitive, very easy to play. This pawn is still a target. So yeah, this is a real possibility of something like this happening in your game. And once again, if this rook sacrifice does not happen, you're going to be much better. If the queen moves, this is just way too passive. And now this pawn can actually get captured. What happens if this bishop does not want to get traded though? And let's say bishop b3 is played, which is the main move in this variation. It's been played like 300 times at very high level games. We're just going to follow up with bishop g7 as we would in the other variations. And I mean, our development is very simple. Our goals are always the same. We want to control this square. We want to attack this square. And we want to trade off pieces where we can. I'm going to show you guys an example for a line. We're going to play knight c6. We're going to castle. By the way, if d5 was to be played, we're going to play knight a5 simply, target this bishop, and then we're going to probably take this knight with check, and then we're going to be able to take this pawn. If the bishop drops back to c2, so if white wants to save this bishop, we're going to take this knight with check, after which we can capture this pawn, and black is significantly better here because of superior piece placement, and we're just up an entire pawn. Also, this pawn needs to be protected, and it's very weak right now. But after knight c6, castles and castles, we're going to get d5. So this is following the same line pretty much, except now that white has castled, this capture does not come with check. However, the line is still the same. So once again, showing you guys that if white chooses to opt in and play bishop b3, black is always going to be able to gain a small or even significant advantage depending on how bad white misplays it. And so this is nothing to be scared of. Just remember that you can always jump your knight into a5, so d5 is never a really big threat. What if white decides to play something besides bishop c4? So another popular move is queen b3. Here we're going to simply just drop our knight back to b6 once again. The ideas are still the same, and the knight on b6 does oversee this d5 square, which is exactly what we'd like. Here the line continues with bishop b5 check, where we block with bishop d7. The reason we block with bishop d7 is because imagine if we block with a knight, This knight is pinned. This bishop cannot develop itself, and this position is just very, very cramped. So it's very difficult to play and kind of expand. Therefore, we're going to start with bishop d7, and then very quickly, we're just going to place a bishop on g7. Once again, the ideas are always the same. Something you might see is knight e5, which looks scary, but it's not. We can just castle, and after all of these trades occur, black is completely fine. Here, actually, one of the top moves is just knight f6, and the point of knight f6 is, once again, you're going to place a knight on d5, so it creates this blockade, sort of that prevents d5 from ever happening. Then you're going to stack your rooks and your queen on the same file. You're going to play queen d6, rook d8, rook c8. You want to take control of this open file, by the way. Since this is a sort of Grunfeld-esque structure, the control of this file is, generally speaking, very important. And guess one last thing to know is e6 is also a popular move here, just before setting up this blockade. So e6, queen d6, rook d8, rook c8, knight d5. Either knight works. I would start with an f knight because that would open up the bishop, and you're going to be winning. If white plays something silly like knight f3, generally speaking, this is going to transpose. So you're probably going to see queen b3 or bishop c4 on the next move. But you can just simply develop with bishop g7. That covers the c takes d5 exchange. Now let's go over the main move, which has been played the most, which is queen to b3. So after g6, queen b3, we're going to play bishop g7. We're actually going to be gambiting this pawn in all of these variations. The point is that we're eventually going to recapture the pawn with knight d7 and knight d6. And once again, we're playing this like an IQP. Here we're going to castle. We don't have to think much about anything else. If we get bishop c4 right away, which is like overprotecting the pawn, very nice move, knight d7. This is just perfect for us if we see bishop c4 because knight b6 will come with tempo, and if we can trade this bishop off, we're going to be very happy. So just an example line for you guys. After this trade occurs, we're going to play b6, and then we're going to drop this bishop in on b7 to add another attacker on this d5 pawn. The reason we don't play bishop g4, for example, is because knight e5 exists. And bishop g4 is a move that you see a lot in the Caro Kann, but not in this sort of style, because this queen is not on d1, so this pin doesn't exist, and therefore this knight on e5 can cause some problems, and it's annoying to play against. A lot of people play bishop f5 here, so most of the theory suggests bishop f5. However, bishop on f5, it's a nice move, but we want to recapture this pawn, and this doesn't really challenge white for anything, so I'd say white is more than comfortable here. Therefore, I've analyze this with an engine, and I think b6 is a much better alternative because after bishop b7, we're going to play rook c8, we're going to play queen d6, rook d8, and we're going to take this pawn. It's just simply impossible to protect it. There are not enough pieces which could aid in the protection of this pawn. We're going to be able to completely equalize, and then we're going to chip away at this sort of isolated pawn on d4. That covers bishop c4. Now let's look over some other moves. Next move I want to cover is knight to e2. This is a very interesting one. It has scored very well for white, so I've prepared a sort of weapon that very few people have used, and I think it's very unique and a very, very good way to strike against this knight e2 variation. The point of knight g to e2 is that white wants to play knight f4 and add additional support to this pawn to prevent us from taking it. The move that I suggest here is a5, and what it does is, first of all, it prepares a4, so it takes as much space as possible. But what it also does is it allows for knight a6 to come in and then knight b4 jump, because this is now an outpost square. And the knight on b6 is very strong. So if we encounter a4, that is exactly our plan. We're going to play knight a6 and then prepare knight b4. Here there's no like sort of concrete theory on what white has to play. White can just continue with knight f4. We're going to play knight b4. The knight on b4 oversees the c2 square, which prepares certain tactics, with the rook and the king. It also attacks the d5 square. With the knight on f6, we're going to try and get as much from that as possible. Say white plays bishop d2, trying to somehow apply more pressure on this knight. For example, we're going to play bishop f5 with the idea of placing a knight on c2. White has to protect it by playing rook c1, otherwise white would be losing. And here we play g5. And this position, believe it or not, is like -2 for black. So white has no good retreat squares. For example, let's say knight e2. We just get this move, which is a fork of the rook, and it's completely winning for black. If, let's say, knight d3, we just win a piece. And the only real move here is knight h3, after which we play h6. Now we've occupied more space here, and we're very happy because, well, d5 is hanging, first and foremost. So we're going to capture that on our next move, if possible. If, let's say, bishop c4, we can just drop this knight back to d7. Now this pawn is hanging, and white's position just falls apart very quickly here. But what if white doesn't play a4 in response to a5? What if white plays knight f4 right away? Well, this is a little bit more tricky, but I have found a very nice line. First of all, we can just start with g5. This sends the knight back to e2. If the knight goes to d3, that's also a possibility. However, afterwards, this is very weird because now this pawn is hanging. Generally speaking, e2 would be a much better move. We're going to play a5, and now we're pretty much gambiting every single pawn. So this pawn is hanging because this knight can take it. This pawn is hanging because the bishop can take it. So after the knight takes this pawn, we're going to capture this one since we've deflected the knight from the protection of the d5 square. Now we can capture the center pawn. White's going to capture on g5, and then we're going to develop to c6, and we're going to aim to take this pawn. A tactic I want to show you guys now is if something like rook d1 was played, we have a very, very nice move that wins an entire piece in the entire game, which is queen a5 check. So after knight c3, which is the only move, by the way. I mean, if that doesn't happen, let's say, I don't even know, the rook blocks, we can just take this knight for free. And this knight is not capturable because rook a5, and we win this bishop. So after queen a5, knight c3, we're going to take this knight. No matter what white recaptures with here, we're going to just win this bishop. So very, very nice tactic. Keep that in mind. But let's say white plays a normal move and just brings the knight back to c3 in order to, once again, support this d5 square and also try to get rid of this knight on d5. We're going to simply jump into b4. And I'm following a game played by a grandmaster right now. So this is real stuff. You can definitely play this and adopt this into real game scenarios. And after rook d1, we had bishop f4. The point is, once again, very simple. You want to play bishop c2 or you want to play knight c2 check. White is forced to play rook d2, which to protect the c2 square, after which we simply play knight d3 check, and white is forced to sacrifice this exchange, because otherwise, let's say white plays king d1, we have knight f2 check, which wins just an entire rook for free. Now that we're up in exchange, we're still down a couple of pawns, so the material, generally speaking, is going to be around equal for some time, but you have two rooks, white only has one, so you're going to be able to capitalize on that. After these sort of captures, you have like queen d6, rook c8, rook b1, or sorry, rook b8, and then you're going to target these pawns. You're going to obviously target this d4 pawn. White's just not going to be able to hold on. Like, there's not enough material. The pieces are too awkwardly placed. This king is in the center. In the variation where this trade occurs, the king is in the center. Black just wins here. Now let's cover bishop e2. Bishop e2 is just the awkward version of g3. The point is you're going to play bishop f3 and add more protection to this pawn. If that were to happen, you can play knight d7 and let's say bishop f3. I'm going to play knight b6. Let's say this happens. We're actually going to play bishop g4, and this is just a very odd case of when two bishops stare right at each other. You're just going to deflect this, and eventually, let's say castles, you're going to bring this knight back, and now this pawn is very, very difficult to protect. So we've achieved what we wanted to, and let's say knight f4, we just kick this knight out. We can play h6. Now this pawn is definitely not defendable, and we're going to be very happy. Last but not least, let's cover g3. G3 is a very difficult move to play against because, well, if we play knight d7 like we normally would and knight b6, with the bishop on g2, we're never going to be able to recapture this pawn because there's just too much material staring down in this pawn. So we have to adopt a very, very different style of play, and this is a very specific line that this is pretty much the only thing you guys have to memorize by heart if you want to place this variation successfully. We have to play e6 here, and after this capture occurs, we're going to play rook e8. It looks like we're losing this rook. However, if this rook gets captured, we simply play bishop d5 check. It's a discovered check on the king, and now this queen is hanging. So that would be completely winning for us. So if white decides to not blunder his queen and plays, let's say, knight g2, we're going to play knight d7. And from there, we're going to set up ideas like bishop c4, queen a5, rook b8, and so forth. And then we're going to try and get a lot of counterplay thanks to the more active pieces we have and this sort of very, very weak queen that in a lot of positions we can trap as well. I'm just going to quickly skim over the rest of this line. You guys can study in depth if you'd like to, but it goes bishop g2, rook d8, and bishop c4. And even though we're down 3 pawns of material, this position is actually evaluated as better for black just because we have super active piece play. For example, b6, we're going to play knight d5. So if this capture occurs, good luck protecting this knight. We're going to play queen e7 and just destroy this position. You can also capture this d4 pawn as well. So in the worst case scenario, we're just going to recapture some of our pawns and we're going to be pretty much equal. But in the best case scenario, we're going to create a devastating attack. I mean, this position is like -7. So completely winning. Guys, memorize this sort of 3-pawn sacrifice. Remember this rook e move in order to set up this bishop d5 attack on the queen. Just make sure you remember this line. And with that, we've officially covered the entire Caro Kann Panov variation. If you guys enjoyed, please consider checking out some of my other videos or subscribing. It really helps a lot, and it helps me continue making those videos. So thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you in a future video.